The sun was just starting to peek through the tall pine trees when Rose Walking Bear opened her eyes that Tuesday morning. At 63, she had been waking up before dawn for most of her life. It was something her grandmother had taught her. Long ago, the early morning hours were sacred, a time when the world was quiet and you could hear your own thoughts clearly. Rose lived alone in a small wooden house on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. The house wasn't much to look at from the outside, weathered gray boards and a roof that leaked when it rained hard. But inside it was filled with warmth. Colorful quilts covered the furniture, and the walls were decorated with family photos and traditional beadwork that Rose had made over the years. She pulled on her worn leather boots and wrapped her favorite shawl around her shoulders. The September air had a bite to it that reminded her winter wasn't far away. Rose grabbed the old metal bucket from beside her kitchen sink and headed toward the door. Every morning for the past 40 years, she had walked down to Willow Creek to fetch fresh water. The reservation's water system worked fine, but Rose preferred the taste of creek water for her morning coffee and tea. The path to the creek was familiar under her feet. She had walked it thousands of times, through every season and in all kinds of weather. Along the way, she passed the old cemetery where many of her relatives were buried, including her parents and her son Michael, who had died in a car accident 30 years ago. She always paused there for a moment, whispering a quiet prayer in Lakota before continuing on as Rose made her way down the gentle slope toward the water. She noticed how peaceful everything seemed. A few birds were starting to chirp in the cottonwood trees, and somewhere in the distance she could hear a dog barking. The creek was running lower than usual because it had been a dry summer, but there was still plenty of clean water flowing over the smooth rocks. She was about halfway to her usual spot when something caught her eye. At first, she thought it might be a pile of old clothes that someone had thrown away. But as she got closer, Rose realized it wasn't clothes at all. It was a child. The boy was curled up against the muddy bank of the creek, his knees pulled up to his chest. His brown hair was tangled and dirty, and his clothes looked like he had been sleeping outside for days. Rose guessed he was probably 7 or 8 years old, though it was hard to tell because he looked so thin and small. What struck Rose most was how still the boy was. He wasn't crying or calling for help. He wasn't even shivering, even though the morning air was cold and his clothes were damp from the creek's moisture. He just sat there, staring at the water with eyes that seemed much too old for such a young face. Rose set down her bucket and approached slowly, the way she might approach a frightened animal. She had raised 4 children of her own and had helped care for many of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren over the years. She knew that scared children needed patience and gentle movements. "Hello, little one," she said softly in English, then repeated the greeting in Lakota. The boy looked up at her but didn't say anything. His eyes were a deep brown color, and Rose could see intelligence in them, but also something else, a kind of wariness that made her heart ache. Rose crouched down a few feet away from the boy, making herself smaller and less threatening. "Are you hurt?" she asked. The boy just stared at her. She tried asking in Lakota, but got the same silent response, looking at him more closely. Rose could see that he had some cuts and scratches on his arms and legs, probably from walking through the brush and trees. His face was dirty, but she could tell he had been crying recently because there were clean streaks down his cheeks. Most concerning was how thin he looked. His clothes hung loose on his small frame, and his cheeks were hollow in a way that suggested he hadn't been eating regularly. Rose's mind was racing with questions. Where had this child come from? Where were his parents? How long had he been out here alone? But she pushed those thoughts aside for now. The most important thing was getting him somewhere safe and warm. "My name is Rose," she said, pointing to herself. "Rose." She waited to see if he would tell her his name, but the boy remained silent. She tried a different approach. "Are you hungry?" she asked, making eating motions with her hands. This time she saw the smallest flicker of response in his eyes. Rose stood up slowly and extended her hand toward the boy. "Come with me," she said gently. "I live right up there." She pointed toward the trees where her house was hidden from view. "I can give you some food and clean clothes." For a long moment the boy just looked at her outstretched hand. Rose could almost see him weighing his options, trying to decide if she could be trusted. Finally, he uncurled himself from his position by the creek and reached out to take her hand. His fingers were ice cold, and Rose could feel him trembling slightly. The walk back to Rose's house was slow. The boy's legs seemed unsteady, and he stumbled a few times on the uneven path. Rose kept a gentle grip on his hand and spoke to him in soft, encouraging tones, even though he didn't respond. She pointed out things along the way: a red cardinal sitting on a fence post, wildflowers growing beside the path, an old oak tree that had been struck by lightning years ago, but still stood strong. When they reached her house, Rose led the boy up the wooden steps to her front porch. She could feel him hesitate at the doorway, as if he was afraid to go inside. "It's okay," Rose said. "You're safe here." She opened the door and gently guided him into her warm kitchen. The first thing Rose did was start a fire in her old wood stove. The house had electric heat, but the wood stove made everything feel more cozy and welcoming. While the fire was getting going, she filled a basin with warm water and found a clean washcloth and towel. "Let's get you cleaned up a little," she said, kneeling down in front of the boy. She began gently washing his face and hands, being careful around the cuts and scrapes. The boy stood perfectly still during this process, but Rose noticed that his eyes followed her every movement. He was clearly trying to figure out what she was going to do next. When she was finished cleaning him up, Rose could see that he was actually a beautiful child. His skin had a golden tone that suggested he might be part Native American, though she couldn't be sure. His features were delicate, and despite everything he had been through, there was something gentle and kind in his expression. Rose went to her bedroom and found some clothes that had belonged to one of her grandsons when he was younger. They were still too big for this thin little boy, but they were clean and warm. She helped him change out of his dirty clothes, trying not to let her concern show when she saw how prominent his ribs were. "Now," Rose said, rolling up the sleeves of the oversized shirt, "let's get some food in you." She put a pot of soup on the stove, a simple vegetable soup that she had made the day before. While it was warming up, she made fresh fry bread, the smell filling the kitchen with warmth and comfort. The boy sat at Rose's small kitchen table, his feet barely touching the floor. When she placed a bowl of soup and a piece of fry bread in front of him, he looked up at her with an expression of disbelief, as if he couldn't quite believe this was really happening. "Go ahead," Rose encouraged him. "Eat." The boy began eating slowly at first, then more quickly, as if he was afraid the food might disappear. Rose watched him with growing concern. This was clearly a child who hadn't been properly cared for, but by who? And for how long? As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, Rose knew she would need to make some phone calls. The tribal police would need to know about finding the boy, and social services would have to be contacted. But for now, she was content to sit in her kitchen, watching this mysterious child eat his first real meal in who knows how long, and wondering what story he would tell when he was ready to speak. After the boy had finished his second bowl of soup, Rose knew she couldn't put off making the phone calls any longer. She watched him curled up on her old couch, wrapped in one of her handmade quilts, and her heart felt heavy with worry. This child clearly belonged to someone, somewhere. But where? Rose picked up her phone and dialed the number for the tribal police. Officer Jimmy Two Hawks had been working on the reservation for 15 years, and Rose had known his family since he was born. When she explained what had happened, Jimmy's voice grew serious. "I'll be right over, Auntie Rose," he said, using the respectful term that younger people on the reservation used for their elders. "Don't let the boy leave, and try not to ask him too many questions until I get there." 20 minutes later, Jimmy's patrol car pulled up in front of Rose's house. He was a tall, quiet man in his 30s who had a gentle way with children. When he stepped into Rose's living room, the boy immediately tensed up and moved closer to Rose on the couch. "It's okay," Rose whispered to the child. "Jimmy is here to help us figure out where you belong." Jimmy crouched down in front of the couch, keeping his voice soft and friendly. "Hey there, buddy. My name is Jimmy. Can you tell me your name?" The boy just stared at him with those same watchful eyes. Jimmy tried a few more questions. Where did he live? What were his parents' names? How old was he? But got no response to any of them. Has he said anything at all? Jimmy asked Rose. Not a single word, Rose replied. He understands what we're saying, I think. He follows simple instructions and responds to his name when I call him, but he won't talk. Jimmy took some photos of the boy and wrote down a description in his notebook. The child appeared to be between 7 and 9 years old, with brown hair and brown eyes. He was wearing clothes that were too big for him, a red t-shirt and blue jeans that Rose had given him. There were no identifying marks, no jewelry, no backpack or belongings of any kind. I need to call this in to the county sheriff and the FBI, Jimmy explained to Rose. Since we're on reservation land, this becomes a federal case. They'll want to check missing persons reports from all over the region. While Jimmy made his phone calls from the kitchen, Rose sat with the boy on the couch. She could see that all the activity was making him nervous. His hands were clenched into small fists, and he kept glancing toward the door as if he was thinking about running. Nobody's going to hurt you, Rose said gently. We just want to find your family and make sure you get home safe. The boy looked at her with an expression that seemed to say he didn't believe anyone was looking for him over the next few hours. Rose's small house became busy with visitors. A social worker named Janet Crow Dog arrived from the tribal offices. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who specialized in working with children. She brought a bag full of toys and books, hoping to get the boy to open up. Sometimes kids will communicate through play even when they won't talk. Janet explained to Rose. She sat on the floor and spread out some coloring books, crayons, and small action figures. The boy watched her with interest but didn't join in. Later that afternoon, Detective Maria Santos from the county sheriff's office came to interview Rose and examine the scene where she had found the boy. Maria was a professional woman in her 40s who had worked many missing children cases over the years. Can you show me exactly where you found him? Maria asked Rose. The two women walked down to Willow Creek, leaving the boy with Janet and Jimmy back at the house. Rose pointed to the spot where the child had been curled up against the bank. Maria looked around carefully, taking notes and photos. There are no tire tracks or footprints that I can see, she said. The ground is too hard and rocky. But this location is interesting. It's not visible from the road, but it's close enough to the houses that someone would eventually find him. You think someone left him there on purpose? Rose asked. It's possible, Maria replied. Sometimes parents who can't care for their children will leave them somewhere they know they'll be found by someone who can help. It's not legal, but it happens more often than people realize. Back at the house, Janet had managed to get the boy interested in a picture book about animals. He wasn't reading it, but he was turning the pages and looking at the illustrations carefully. When he came to a page with a picture of horses, he stopped and traced the outline of one with his finger. Do you like horses? Janet asked. The boy looked up at her and nodded, the first clear response he had given to anyone. Janet made a note in her file. By evening, the initial investigation had revealed very little. No missing children matching his description had been reported anywhere in South Dakota, Nebraska, or Wyoming. The FBI had run his photo through their database of missing children nationwide, but no matches came up. This is unusual, Detective Santos told Rose. Most missing children are reported within hours of disappearing. The fact that no one has filed a report suggests either that no one knows he's missing yet, or that whoever was supposed to be caring for him isn't going to report it. Dr. Patricia Elk Nation, a child psychologist who worked with the Indian Health Service, came to evaluate the boy the next day. She was a soft-spoken woman in her 50s who had grown up on the reservation herself. She spent 2 hours with the child, using play therapy techniques and simple psychological tests. He's definitely traumatized, Dr. Elk Nation explained to Rose afterward. His silence appears to be selective mutism, which is a response to severe stress or trauma. Children who develop this condition usually can speak, but they choose not to because speaking has become associated with danger or pain in their minds. Will he get better? Rose asked. With time, patience, and the right environment, most children do recover, the doctor said. The fact that he's responding to you and seems to trust you is a very good sign. He needs stability and safety right now more than anything else. As the days passed, more details about the boy's condition became clear. He was severely underweight and showed signs of long-term malnutrition. His teeth needed dental work, and he had several untreated cuts and bruises in various stages of healing. Most troubling were the burn marks on his arms that looked like they might have been made by cigarettes. Someone has been hurting this child for a while, Dr. Elk Nation told the case team during a meeting at the tribal offices. These injuries didn't happen overnight. The investigation expanded to include Child Protective Services from 3 different states. Social workers checked their files for any children who had been removed from homes in the past year. They contacted shelters, hospitals, and schools within a 200-mile radius of Pine Ridge. Still, no one recognized the boy or knew where he might have come from. Meanwhile, Rose was discovering more about her mysterious house guest. He was clearly intelligent. He could dress himself, use the bathroom independently, and follow complex instructions. He seemed to understand both English and at least some Lakota words. He was fascinated by Rose's traditional beadwork and would sit quietly watching her work for hours. The boy also showed a remarkable connection to animals. When Rose's neighbor Annie Red Cloud brought her old dog Chief over to visit, the child immediately went to the animal and began gently petting him. Chief, who was usually suspicious of strangers, seemed to sense something special about the boy and lay down beside him. Animals know things about people that we don't, Annie told Rose. Chief can tell this boy has a good heart, even if he's been hurt. 2 weeks after finding the boy, Rose was no closer to knowing who he was or where he had come from. The investigation had hit dead ends at every turn. But she was learning other things about him. He liked to help with simple household tasks. He was left-handed, and he had nightmares almost every night that left him shaking and sweating. Rose had started thinking of him by a Lakota named Little Hawk, because of the way he watched everything around him with such sharp attention. She hadn't used the name out loud yet, but in her mind, that's who he was becoming. The social workers were starting to talk about finding him a foster placement. But Rose could see how the boy reacted every time strangers came to the house. He would move closer to her and watch the visitors with the same wariness he had shown that first morning by the creek. He needs to stay here, Rose told Janet Crow Dog during one of their meetings. At least until we know more about what happened. To him, moving him now would just add more trauma. Janet nodded thoughtfully. I agree. You're the first stable thing that's happened to this child in who knows how long. But Rose, you need to understand that this could be a long-term situation. We may never find his family. Rose looked over at the boy who was sitting at her kitchen table carefully coloring a picture of an eagle. Then maybe, she said quietly, it's time to start thinking about what's best for him, not just what's easiest for the system. October brought the first snow to Pine Ridge, and with it, a quiet transformation in Rose's household. The boy she had started calling Little Hawk in her mind had been living with her for nearly a month. While he still hadn't spoken a single word, small changes were happening every day that gave Rose hope. The nightmares were becoming less frequent. At first, Little Hawk would wake up screaming almost every night, his small body drenched in sweat and shaking with terror. Rose would rush to his bedside and hold him until the fear passed, speaking softly in Lakota and English until his breathing returned to normal. Now, he might have a bad dream only once or twice a week, and when he did, he would sometimes come to Rose's room on his own, standing quietly by her bed until she woke up and invited him to crawl under the covers beside her. Rose had set up a small bed for him in what used to be her sewing room. She decorated the walls with pictures of animals and landscapes, thinking they might be calming for a child who seemed so connected to nature. Little Hawk spent hours looking at these pictures, especially one of wild horses running across a prairie. Sometimes Rose would find him standing in front of that picture, his finger tracing the outline of the horses, just like he had done with Janet's book the tribal court had approved. Rose as Little Hawk's temporary guardian while the investigation continued. This meant he could stay with her indefinitely, and it also meant Rose could start making decisions about his daily care and education. The first thing she decided was that he needed to see more of the reservation and meet more people in a gradual, non-threatening way. Rose's neighbor, Annie Red Cloud, became an important part of this process. Annie was a widow in her 70s who kept several horses on her property. She had noticed how Little Hawk reacted to animals, and she offered to let him help with the daily care of her horses. "Horses are good teachers," Annie told Rose. "They can sense fear and hurt in people, but they also know how to be gentle when someone needs healing." Every morning after breakfast, Rose and Little Hawk would walk over to Annie's place. At first, the boy was afraid of the large animals and would hide behind Rose when they approached the fence. But Annie was patient. She showed him how to hold out his hand flat so the horses could sniff him without being afraid of getting bitten. She taught him how to brush their coats with long, gentle strokes, and how to clean their hooves. Little Hawk took to these tasks naturally. Within a week, he was confidently leading the gentlest horse, an old Mare named Grandmother, around the small pasture. The horse seemed to understand that this was a special child who needed extra care. She would lower her head so he could reach her ears to pet them, and she never pulled on the lead rope or tried to wander away from him. "Look at that," Annie said to Rose one morning as they watched Little Hawk carefully braiding flowers into Grandmother's mane. "That boy has healing hands. Animals can always tell." Rose was also working to introduce Little Hawk to traditional Lakota customs and language. Every morning, she would burn sage and teach him how to wash the smoke over his body for cleansing and protection. She explained the meaning behind each direction: east for new beginnings, south for growth, west for reflection, and north for wisdom. Little Hawk absorbed these lessons quietly. His eyes serious and attentive, Rose began teaching him basic Lakota words, starting with simple things like mi'ai for water, maka for earth, and hu'wai for sun. She would point to objects around the house and say the words in both languages. Little Hawk never repeated the words out loud, but Rose could tell he was learning them. Sometimes she would catch him mouthing the words silently when he thought no one was looking. The breakthrough came during a visit from Rose's great-nephew, Tommy Crow Dog, who was 8 years old and full of energy. Tommy had heard about the quiet boy staying with his great-aunt, and he was curious to meet him. Rose was worried that Tommy's loud, playful personality might overwhelm Little Hawk, but she decided it was worth trying. Tommy arrived on a Saturday morning, bursting through Rose's front door with his usual enthusiasm. "Auntie Rose, where's the boy everyone's talking about?" Little Hawk immediately retreated to the corner of the living room, watching this new person with cautious eyes. But Tommy had a gift that many children possess. He could sense when someone needed gentleness instead of excitement. He slowed down his movements and spoke more quietly. "Hi," he said simply. "I'm Tommy. Want to see something cool?" Tommy pulled a small wooden flute from his backpack. "My grandpa taught me how to make music with this," he said. He began playing a simple, haunting melody that filled Rose's living room with beautiful sound. Little Hawk's eyes widened with interest, and he took a few steps closer. "You want to try?" Tommy asked, offering the flute. Little Hawk shook his head, but he sat down on the floor near Tommy, listening intently as the older boy continued to play. Over the next few hours, something magical happened. Tommy had brought a bag of smooth stones that he had collected from the creek, and he showed Little Hawk how to stack them into towers and make patterns with them. The two boys played together in comfortable silence, with Tommy chattering occasionally about his school or his friends, but never pressuring Little Hawk to respond. When it was time for Tommy to go home, he did something that surprised everyone. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small carved wooden horse, one of his most treasured possessions. "This is for you," he told Little Hawk, "so you don't forget that you have friends here." Little Hawk accepted the gift with both hands, holding it carefully as if it were made of glass. For the first time since Rose had found him, she saw something that looked like a smile cross his face. After Tommy left, Little Hawk carried the wooden horse with him everywhere. He slept with it under his pillow and kept it in his pocket during the day. Rose understood that this simple gift had been more than just a toy. It was proof that he belonged somewhere, that someone his own age accepted him. Word of the quiet boy staying with Rose Walking Bear had spread throughout the reservation community, and people began stopping by to offer help and support. Elder Joseph Brings Plenty, who was known for his traditional healing ceremonies, came to visit one afternoon. He was a man in his 80s with long, white braids and eyes that seemed to see everything. Joseph spent an hour sitting quietly with Little Hawk, not trying to make him talk or asking him questions. Instead, he told stories in Lakota about the old days, about brave warriors and wise women, about animals who could speak and children who were blessed with special gifts. Little Hawk listened to every word, even though Rose wasn't sure how much of the Lakota language he understood. Before leaving, Joseph placed his weathered hand gently on Little Hawk's head and spoke a blessing in their native language. "This boy has been through a great darkness," he told Rose afterward, "but his spirit is strong. The Creator brought him to you for a reason." Dr. Patricia Elk Nation continued to visit regularly, monitoring Little Hawk's progress and helping Rose understand his needs. She brought art supplies, crayons, markers, and paper and encouraged him to draw his feelings since he couldn't express them with words. Little Hawk's drawings were revealing. Most of them showed dark, scary scenes, houses on fire, people with angry faces, and small figures hiding in corners. But gradually, new images began to appear. He drew pictures of horses, of Rose's house with smoke coming from the chimney, and of himself standing next to a woman who could only be Rose, both of them smiling. "These drawings show incredible progress," Dr. Elk Nation told Rose. "He's processing his trauma through art, and more importantly, he's beginning to see himself as safe and cared for." The reservation school system had been patient about Little Hawk's education, but as November approached, they began discussing the possibility of him starting classes. Rose was nervous about this. She had seen how he reacted to strangers and new situations, and she worried that a classroom full of children might be overwhelming. "What if we start slowly?" suggested the school principal, Patricia Wounded Knee. "He could come for just an hour a day, maybe during art time or when the children are working quietly. No pressure to participate, just getting used to being around other kids." Rose decided to try it. She would drive Little Hawk to school each morning and stay with him in the classroom for the first week. The teacher, Miss Helen Fasthorse, was a gentle woman who had experience working with children who had special needs. The first few days were difficult. Little Hawk clung to Rose's hand and refused to sit anywhere except right next to her. But Miss Fasthorse was patient and creative. She gave him simple tasks, organizing crayons by color, helping to water the classroom plants, feeding the class pet rabbit. These activities seemed to calm him and give him a sense of purpose. By the end of his first week at school, Little Hawk was sitting at a desk with the other children, though he still didn't speak or participate in group activities. Rose began, leaving him for short periods, first for just 15 minutes, then for half an hour. Each time she returned, she found him quietly working on whatever task he had been given, his wooden horse sitting on his desk where he could see it. The other children in the class had been told that Little Hawk couldn't talk. Spring came early to Pine Ridge that year, and with it, preparations for the annual powwow began in earnest. Rose had been looking forward to this event for months, not just because it was one of the most important celebrations on the reservation, but because she hoped it might help Little Hawk feel more connected to his new community. The boy had been living with her for almost 8 months now, and while he still hadn't spoken a single word, Rose could see him changing in small, but meaningful ways every day. He had grown taller and stronger, his cheeks had filled out from Rose's good cooking, and there was a brightness in his eyes that hadn't been there when she first found him by the creek. Little Hawk had also developed some routines that brought him comfort. Every morning, he would help Rose with the sage smudging ceremony, carefully watching as she lit the sacred plant and waved the smoke over both of them. He had learned to braid his own hair in the traditional style, though Rose usually had to help him finish it properly. And he spent at least an hour each day with Annie's horses, especially Grandmother, who had become his closest friend among the animals. The powwow preparations were exciting, but also overwhelming for Little Hawk. The reservation was buzzing with activity as families got their traditional outfits ready, practiced their dances, and prepared special foods for the celebration. Rose could see that all the noise and commotion made the boy nervous, but she also noticed that he was curious about what was happening. "Would you like to help me get ready for the powwow?" Rose asked him one morning as she was laying out her traditional dress on her bed. The dress was beautiful, deep blue with intricate beadwork that Rose's grandmother had taught her to make decades ago. Little Hawk nodded and came closer to examine the tiny beads and detailed patterns. Rose showed him how each bead had been sewn on by hand, explaining the meaning behind the different colors and designs. "Blue is for the sky and for wisdom," she said, pointing to the dominant color. "The white beads represent purity and new beginnings, and these red ones are for courage and strength." Little Hawk reached out tentatively to touch the beadwork, his fingers tracing the patterns with the same careful attention he gave to everything that interested him. Rose had an idea. "Would you like to learn how to do beadwork?" she asked. "I could teach you to make something simple." Over the next few days, Rose taught Little Hawk the basics of beading. She started him with a simple bracelet pattern, showing him how to thread the needle and how to make sure each bead was positioned correctly. The work required patience and concentration, two qualities that Little Hawk had in abundance. To Rose's amazement, the boy took to beadwork naturally. His small fingers were steady and precise, and he seemed to understand instinctively how the patterns should flow together. Within a week, he had completed his first bracelet, a simple design in blue and white that he wore proudly on his wrist. "You have a gift for this," Rose told him as she examined his work. "Your grandmother would be proud." She always spoke to him as if he might respond, even though she knew he wouldn't. But something about the way his eyes lit up when she praised his work told her that her words mattered to him. As the powwow approached, Rose made a decision that surprised even herself. She was going to make Little Hawk his own traditional outfit, so he could participate in the celebration. She had been thinking about this for weeks, wondering if it would be too much for him, but something in her heart told her it was the right thing to do. Rose spent every evening for 2 weeks working on a small version of a traditional boy's outfit. She made him a vest decorated with geometric patterns in blue, white, and red beads. She sewed a pair of leggings with ribbon work along the sides, and she crafted a small roach headdress with eagle feathers that had been given to her by Elder Joseph Brings plenty specifically for this purpose. The night before the powwow, Rose laid out Little Hawk's completed outfit on his bed. When he saw it, his eyes grew wide with wonder. He touched each piece carefully as if he couldn't believe it was really for him. "This is yours," Rose said gently. "Tomorrow you'll be able to dance with all the other children if you want to. Or you can just watch, whatever feels right to you." That night Little Hawk barely slept. Rose could hear him moving around in his room, and when she peeked in, she saw him sitting by the window, looking at his new outfit in the moonlight. She could see the wooden horse that Tommy had given him clutched in his hands, his constant companion whenever he felt nervous or uncertain. The morning of the powwow dawned bright and clear. Rose helped Little Hawk get dressed in his traditional outfit, braiding his hair extra carefully and showing him how to wear the roach headdress properly. When she was finished, she stepped back to look at him, and her breath caught in her throat. Standing before her was not the frightened, silent boy she had found by the creek, but a young Lakota warrior in training. The traditional clothes seemed to transform him, giving him a dignity and presence that took Rose by surprise. For a moment she saw not just Little Hawk, but all the ancestors who had worn similar outfits, all the children who had learned these traditions, all the generations of her people who had found strength in their culture. "You look beautiful," she whispered, and for the first time in months, she saw tears in Little Hawk's eyes, but these were different tears, tears of something that might have been joy. The powwow grounds were already busy when Rose and Little Hawk arrived. Families were setting up their chairs around the large circle where the dancing would take place. Vendors were arranging their tables with jewelry, artwork, and traditional foods. The drum groups were preparing their instruments and practicing their songs. Little Hawk stayed close to Rose at first, overwhelmed by all the activity and noise. But as the opening ceremonies began, something seemed to shift in him. When the eagle staff was brought into the circle and everyone stood to honor it, Little Hawk stood too, his small hand placed over his heart in the traditional gesture of respect. The children's dances were scheduled for the afternoon. Rose had told Miss Fast Horse and several other people that Little Hawk might participate, but she wasn't sure he would actually do it when the time came. As the announcer called for all the children to come into the circle, Rose looked down at Little Hawk questioningly. "You don't have to," she said softly. "We can just watch from here." But Little Hawk surprised her. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked toward the circle. Rose's heart pounded as she watched him join the group of children, ranging in age from tiny toddlers to teenagers. He looked so small among them, but he didn't back away. The drums began to beat, and the children started to move in the traditional steps. Little Hawk didn't know the formal dance moves, but he began to move with the rhythm, swaying slightly and stepping in time with the beat. His movements were simple but heartfelt, and Rose could see that he was completely absorbed in the moment. As the dance continued, something extraordinary happened. Little Hawk began to smile. Not the small, careful smiles that Rose had seen occasionally over the past months, but a real, radiant smile that lit up his entire face. He was dancing with his whole body, his arms moving gracefully, his feet finding the rhythm naturally. Elder Joseph Brings Plenty, who was sitting near Rose, leaned over and spoke to her. "Look at that boy," he said in Lakota. "The spirits are with him today. He's remembering who he is." When the children's dance ended, Little Hawk returned to Rose's side, his face flushed with excitement and something that looked like pure happiness. Rose knelt down and hugged him tightly, feeling her own tears starting to flow. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered in his ear. "You were wonderful out there." As they sat together watching the adult dances, Rose began to tell Little Hawk stories about the different dance styles and what they meant. She pointed out the fancy dancers with their colorful, flowing outfits, the traditional dancers who moved with dignified, precise steps, and the grass dancers whose movements mimicked the swaying of prairie grass in the wind. "Dancing is how we talk to the Creator," Rose explained. "It's how we show our gratitude for all the good things in our lives, and how we ask for help when we need it. Every step has meaning, every movement tells a story." Little Hawk listened intently, his eyes following the dancers as they moved around the circle. Rose could see that he was absorbing everything, filing it away in his memory for future reference. As the sun began to set and the powwow started to wind down, Rose began preparing to leave. She was packing up their chairs when she felt a small hand tugging on her dress. She looked down to see Little Hawk standing beside her, his mouth moving as if he was trying to say something. Rose knelt down to his level, her heart suddenly racing. "What is it, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Little Hawk looked into her eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered one single, perfect word, "Mom." The word was so quiet that Rose almost thought she had imagined it. But then Little Hawk said it again, slightly louder this time, "Mom." Rose felt the world stop spinning around her. After 8 months of silence, 8 months of wondering if this boy would ever speak, 8 months of loving him without hearing him say a single word, he had finally found his voice. And the first word he chose to say was the one that mattered most. The word "Mom" opened a door that had been locked inside Little Hawk for nearly a year. In the days following the powwow, he began to speak more, though his words came slowly and carefully, as if he was testing each one before letting it out into the world. His second sentence came 3 days after the powwow, when Rose was making breakfast. Little Hawk was sitting at the kitchen table, watching her flip pancakes on the old iron skillet. "Thank you," he said quietly, so quietly that Rose almost missed it. When she turned around, he was looking directly at her with those same serious brown eyes, but now there was something different in them, trust, and maybe even the beginning of peace. "You're welcome, sweetheart," Rose replied, keeping her voice gentle so she wouldn't startle him back into silence. "You don't have to thank me for taking care of you. That's what moms do." Over the following weeks, Little Hawk began to share pieces of his story. The words came in fragments, usually when he and Rose were doing quiet activities together, beading, Cooking or sitting on the porch in the evenings watching the sunset? Rose learned not to push him or ask too many questions. She just listened when he was ready to talk and stayed quiet when he needed silence. "There was a man," Little Hawk said one evening as Rose was braiding his hair before bed. He got angry. A lot, especially when he was drinking the brown bottles. Rose's hand stilled for a moment, but she didn't say anything, just continued the gentle rhythm of the braiding. "The lady, she cried sometimes," Little Hawk continued. "She said she was sorry, but she never stopped him when he got mad at me." Rose could hear the confusion in his voice, the voice of a child trying to understand why the adults who were supposed to protect him had hurt him instead. "Sometimes they would drive me places and tell me to wait," he said another time while he was helping Rose weed her small vegetable garden. "I waited at a gas station for 2 days once. A nice man who worked there gave me crackers and let me sleep in the back room. But then they came back and were angry that I had talked to him." These conversations helped Dr. Patricia Elk Nation, and the social workers pieced together more of Little Hawk's background. It became clear that he had been living with people who were struggling with addiction and possibly mental illness. The pattern of abandonment and retrieval explained why he had learned not to cry or call for help. Experience had taught him that no one would come, and making noise only made things worse. "The creek was different," Little Hawk told Rose one day as they were walking down the familiar path to Willow Creek, carrying buckets to collect water just like they had that first morning. "They said someone would find me there who could take better care of me. They said they were sorry, but they couldn't keep me safe anymore." Rose stopped walking and knelt down beside the spot where she had found him almost a year ago. "Were you scared?" she asked gently. Little Hawk nodded. "But I was scared with them too. At least by the creek, no one was yelling." He paused, looking at the water flowing over the smooth stones. "And then you came, and you had kind eyes, like grandmother." He was talking about Annie's old mare, who had become his constant companion and source of comfort. The legal process of making Little Hawk officially Rose's son took several more months. The authorities had never been able to locate his birth parents or any other relatives, and after a year of searching, the case was closed. Little Hawk, who told them his birth name had been David, chose to take Rose's family name. He became David Walking Bear, though Rose continued to call him Little Hawk at home. As David grew more comfortable with speaking, his personality began to emerge more fully. He was naturally quiet and thoughtful, preferring to listen rather than talk, but when he did speak, his words carried weight. He had a gentle sense of humor that showed itself in small smiles and occasional soft laughter. And he had an artist's eye for beauty, whether he was creating intricate beadwork patterns or carving small animals from pieces of wood that Annie's son brought him. The wood carving became more than just a hobby. It was David's way of processing his experiences and expressing feelings that were still too difficult to put into words. He carved horses that looked exactly like grandmother, eagles with outstretched wings, and small human figures that Rose suspected represented the people who had become important to him. When David turned 10, Rose organized a small birthday party. For him, it was the first birthday celebration he could remember having, and he was both excited and nervous about it. Rose invited Tommy Crow Dog, who was now 11 and had become David's closest friend, along with a few other children from school and some of the adults who had been part of David's healing journey. Red Cloud brought grandmother to the party, decorating the old mare with ribbons and allowing the children to take turns riding her around the yard. Elder Joseph Brings Plenty came with his drum and taught the children traditional songs. Dr. Patricia Elk Nation brought art supplies and helped the kids make friendship bracelets, but the most meaningful gift came from an unexpected source. Miss Helen Fasthorse, David's teacher, had been working with the tribal historians to research traditional Lakota names that might suit David's personality and experiences. She presented him with a beautifully painted scroll that explained the meaning of his chosen name. "Little Hawk," she read aloud to the gathered group, "represents sharp vision, courage in the face of danger, and the ability to soar above difficult circumstances. In our tradition, hawks are messengers between the earth and the sky, between the human world and the spirit world. David listened to these words with his characteristic serious attention, then looked up at Rose. "Is that really what my name means?" he asked. "It's what your name means now," Rose replied. "Names can grow and change just like people do. When I first started calling you Little Hawk, it was because of how carefully you watched everything around you. But now I think it fits you for all the reasons Ms. Fasthorse just explained." As David entered his teenage years, he began to take on more responsibilities around the house and in the community. He helped Rose with her beadwork business, which had grown as word spread about the beautiful pieces they created together. He assisted Annie with her horses, and he had become skilled enough at wood carving that people began commissioning pieces from him. More importantly, David had begun to use his own experiences to help other children. When social services brought other troubled or traumatized children to the reservation, David would often spend time with them, not trying to make them talk or pressuring them to participate, but simply being present in the way that Rose had been present for him. "He understands their silence," Dr. Patricia Elk Nation observed during one of her regular check-ins. "He knows what it feels like to be so hurt that words don't feel safe anymore. That's a gift he can give to other children who are going through what he went through." When David was 16, he made a decision that both surprised and touched Rose deeply. He wanted to participate in a traditional vision quest, a rite of passage that involved spending 4 days alone in the wilderness, fasting and praying for spiritual guidance about his path in life. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Rose asked him. She knew that being alone for extended periods might trigger memories of his abandonment and trauma. "I think I need to do this," David replied. "I need to spend time alone with the Creator and ask for guidance about how I'm supposed to use what happened to me. I can't run from being alone forever." Elder Joseph Brings Plenty agreed to guide David through the Vision Quest process. They spent weeks preparing, with Joseph teaching David the proper prayers and ceremonies, and Rose making sure he was physically and emotionally ready for the challenge. David spent 4 days on a hill overlooking Willow Creek, the place where his new life had begun. When he returned, he was quiet for several days, processing whatever he had experienced during his time alone. Finally, he shared his vision with Rose and Joseph. "I saw myself as a bridge," he said. "I was standing between two worlds, the world of hurt children and the world of healing families. My job is to help children cross from one side to the other, the way you helped me cross, Mom." This vision shaped David's future choices. He excelled in high school and earned a scholarship to study social work at the University of South Dakota. His goal was to return to Pine Ridge and work with the Tribal Social Services Department, specializing in helping children who had experienced trauma and abandonment during his college years. David met Rebecca Crow Elk, a young woman from the reservation who was studying to become a teacher. Rebecca had grown up hearing stories about the silent boy who had been found by the creek and raised by Rose Walking Bear. When she met David, she was struck by his gentleness and his deep commitment to helping others. They married 2 years after. David graduated from college in a traditional Lakota ceremony held on the hill where David had completed his vision quest. Rose, now in her 70s but still strong and vibrant, cried tears of joy as she watched her adopted son promise to love and honor the woman who would become her daughter-in-law. David and Rebecca built their own home on the reservation, not far from Rose's house. David took a job with the Indian Child Welfare Program, working to ensure that Native American children in crisis were placed with